The waiting room of the Crossveen Veterinary Trauma Hall emptied itself in 11 seconds, and Surgeon Reskaven counted every one of them. She was standing at the intake desk, signing off a routine molt infection when the freight doors banged open, and two human transport medics came through at a run, hauling a field stretcher between them, and the thing on the stretcher was bleeding through its dressings and still trying to get up. A velhound the size of a cargo skid, an animal bred on Maul to kill burrowing armorbacks. An animal that had bitten 3 handlers that year, took one breath of the air coming off the stretcher and flattened itself against the floor tiles. So hard its harness buckles rang. Its owner did not wait to ask why. By the time the stretcher cleared the second door, every patient, every owner, every crated and leashed and muzzled animal in the room had pressed itself out the public exit, and the only sound left was the wet, steady rasp of the thing on the stretcher breathing. It was a dog. Reska knew the word the way she knew most human words, from manifests and customs forms. Deathworld origin companion canid, Earthstock. This one was big through the shoulders and dark along the spine, sable and tan, and there was so much dried mud and blood matted into its coat that for a moment she could not find where the animal ended and the wound began. Its eyes were open. That was the first thing she would remember later when people asked. Half its blood volume on a stretcher, a hind leg wrapped in a pressure sleeve gone rust-colored, pads burned, and its eyes were open and moving, checking the corners of the room, checking the doors, checking the medics, checking her. Not panic, inventory. Female, intact, approximately 40 kilos before whatever she lost on the way here, said the lead medic. He was young and gray-faced, and his voice had the flatness of a man who had been awake too long and seen something he was not processing yet. Crushed trauma, lacerations, thermal burns to all 4 feet, smoke exposure. She was in the ground at Bore 4, the collapse this morning. Reska's hearing membranes tightened. Everyone on Redgate had heard about Bore 4 by noon. A gallery wall had let go in the Cardin Combine's old geothermal field 11 kilometers northwest of town, and one of the human survey contractors had been inside it when it went. The handler, she said, didn't make it. The medic's jaw worked. She did. She dug. We clocked her at it for 11 hours before anyone could get a line on her, and she only stopped because the second slip buried the face she was working and broke something in her foot doing it. She found him. She wouldn't. He stopped, restarted, kept it clinical. Recovery team had to sedate her twice to take the body. The first dose did nothing. The second dose did almost nothing. The animal's eyes had finished with the room and come back to Reska and stayed there. Vethrin read heat the way other species read faces. The pits along Reska's jaw took in the dog's whole thermal map in one slow pass, and what she saw made no sense against the chart the medic was waving. Core temperature stable. Heart rate elevated, but even, not the ragged saw blade of an animal in shock, but the deep banked rhythm of an athlete holding a pace. The leg was a ruin of heat. The body around it had simply decided not to participate in the emergency. Surgeon Prime Othek arrived at the intake desk, looked at the stretcher for the length of one breath, and said no. She's crashing, the medic said, which was not true, and Othek knew it was not true, and that made it worse. This facility is not licensed for Deathworld class biota. Othek's dorsal plates had gone pale, which among Cusk meant either rage or fear, and Othek had never once in 6 years been enraged. There is a containment protocol. There is a human enclave facility 400 kilometers away and she will not survive. The medic caught himself again. Sir, she dug for 11 hours. Then she has expended herself usefully, and I am sorry. The liability alone, if that animal regains mobility on my table, in my theater with my staff in the room. Othek did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Every story, every Cusk on Maul had ever been told about Earth ran through the room without anyone saying it. Reska was already pulling the intake slate toward herself. She heard her own voice sign the case the way she sometimes watched her own hands operate, from a small, calm distance. Transfer of primary to Surgeon Ven exotic and unclassified biota provisional credential case accepted at intake. Notation, no other qualified surgeon available. She looked up at Othek. That last line protects you, Surgeon Prime. It's my license in the box, not yours. It will be your career in the box, Othek said. His plates had not regained their color, and possibly your staff. Then I'll take volunteers only. Reska turned to the theater corridor and found that her 2 scrub assistants had already gone, which answered that, and that the night shift intern Imkit was still standing there, slight and membrane folded and visibly terrified, with surgical gloves already on. You understand what she is, Reska said. No, Surgeon, Imkit said. But she watched the doors until the doors were dealt with, and then she stopped. I've sedated Draxorians who had less command of a room. The intern's gliding membranes shivered flat. I'd like to assist. They took the dog through to Theater 2, and the dog let them, which was the part Reska could not make fit. The stretcher transfer should have been the moment everything went wrong. A deathworld predator in pain, strange hands, strange smells, restraint. The dog raised her head once, took stock of the table, the lights, the instrument trays, the two beings lifting her, and then she put her head down and held still. Not collapsed, held still. Reska had spent 9 years operating on creatures that fought the table with their last gram of strength, and she had no category for an animal that triaged its own situation and elected to cooperate. The surgery itself, she would later describe, in the case file that half the veterinary services on 3 worlds would eventually request copies of, as the most disorienting 4 hours of her career. Everything about the patient was wrong in the direction of more. Clotting cascade so aggressive she had to reopen the first vessel she ligated just to confirm she had actually done it. Bone density that bent her standard pins until Imkit thought to sterilize a set rated for armored grazers. Muscle fascia layered like ship plating. A heart that sat there at the bottom of the anesthesia like a deep engine, turning over slow and contemptuous of the dose, while the gas analyzer kept asking Reska in increasingly bright warning colors whether her patient was perhaps 2 animals. The foot, Imkit said at hour 3 very quietly, with the tone the young reserved for cathedral interiors. Surgeon. She dug through rockfall with this foot after it broke. Yes. The pain rating on this fracture pattern. For a Grolin I would write incompatible with weight bearing. She bore weight on it for hours. Yes, Reska said, and rechecked a suture line her hands had already finished because the heat coming off the wound margins was doing something she had never seen tissue do, which was begin already visibly to knit. It was Imkit who found the tag. The harness had come off in pieces, they'd had to cut it, and the intern was bagging the remains as personal, effects when the membranes along Imkit's arms suddenly stood up. A steel plate, riveted to the chest strap, stamped in human block letters and then again below in trade script. Imkit read it out loud before thinking better of it. Juno. Survey K9, Redgate Contract 7. If I am alone, my handler is not coming. Call this number. The theater was very quiet. On the table, stitched and splinted and burned and finally chemically asleep, the dog's chest rose and fell on its slow engine rhythm. Reska looked at the tag for a long moment. Then she said, call the number, and went back to closing, because there was nothing else to do with what she was feeling, and the wound was still open. The number reached a contractor's field voicemail belonging to Del Arno, surveyor 2nd grade, Cardin Combine Geothermal Assessment, Redgate Contract 7. The recording was a young man's voice, cheerful, slightly rushed, promising to call back by end of shift. He had recorded it 8 months ago. He had been dead since 6:15 that morning. The hospital's administrator made the second call to the Human Enclave's labor office, asking the question that intake protocol required. Who assumes responsibility for the animal? The answer came back in writing within the hour, and Reska read it twice. Contract 7 terminated by fatality. Surveyor Arno Dell, no listed family on Mall. Animal asset Juno. Classification Deathworld origin working canid. Ownership lapse, status, and here the form supplied its own cold word, unclaimed. There was 1 human on the Cross-Vane staff. There was in fact exactly 1 human in the building most days, and her name was Tess Vane, and she was 23 years old and had been hired 8 months earlier to haul feed, scrub kennels, and answer the questions about Earth animals that no one else could answer. She came on shift at dusk, read the intake board, and stopped walking so abruptly that the orderly behind her hit her with a feed cart. Reska found her outside Recovery 4, looking through the observation pane with both hands flat on the glass. On the other side, in a recovery bay built for animals twice her size, the dog lay on the heated pad exactly where the transfer team had left her, and she was awake. 18 minutes out of a gas plane that should have held a Grolin under for half a day, and she was awake, head up, splinted legs stretched stiff in front of her, watching the door. That's a Survey K9, Tess said. Her voice was doing something complicated and she was letting it. Gas and ground dog. They trained them on seismic acoustics and air chemistry. There were 2 on planet. Del Arno ran the other. She stopped. She had heard about Boar 4 too. Everyone had. That's Juno, she said. Much smaller. That's Del's Juno. You knew the handler? Everybody knew Del. He brought her to the Enclave market on rest days. Tess's hands were still on the glass. He used to say she clocked on the moment the harness did. Off harness, she'd flop on her back in the dust for any kid who'd scratch her. On harness, you couldn't bribe her with a steak. She swallowed. Why is she watching the door like that? Reska looked through the pane with her whole face, heat pits and all. She had been looking at the dog's thermal map, on and off, for 10 hours now, and she had watched it do something she had no clinical language for. Pain made heat, fear made heat, a particular flickering kind. The dog's body was a furnace of injury and repair, all of it orderly, but laid over the top of it in the last hour, as the sedation thinned and the awareness came back, and the dog had time to take inventory of more than threats, a different pattern had crept in, and it was not heat. It was a stillness in the map, a banked-down place, center chest, like a room where someone had gone through and turned every lamp down at once. She is watching the door, Reska said, because the last time she saw her handler, he went somewhere she could not follow, and doors are how that happens. I am told the recovery team took the body from her. She has not yet had any evidence that he is not simply elsewhere. She heard how it sounded only after she said it, not like a surgeon, like a witness. Specialist Vane, the animal will not eat for us. She took water once, when the intern left and the room was empty, as if it were a tactical resupply. The literature on earth canids says they can grieve themselves into organ failure, and the literature on this one says she is too strong for any of my equipment to save her from it if she decides to. I am asking whether you will help. Tess Vane took her hands off the glass, and Reska watched the young woman's own thermal map flare and steady, like someone breathing on a coal. Open the door, Tess said. Protocol said no. Protocol for deathworld class biota, said feeding chute and remote observation and a containment officer on call. Reska had already broken protocol 9 times before midnight, and she logged the 10th without hesitating. Door opened by surgeon's authorization, human staff member admitted to recovery bay, surgeon present. What happened was nothing. That was what Reska wrote, and the word did more work than any word she had ever put in a chart. Tess walked in slow, talking the whole time, a low stream of human nonsense. Hey, big girl, hey, look at you, I know, and sat down against the wall 2 meters from the pad, beside the door, where the dog's eyes had to choose between her and the exit. The dog looked at her for a long time, scented the air, once, twice, the enclave on her, the feed barns, the market dust. Maybe Reska would wonder about this for weeks, some thread of a rest day crowd in a young man's hands. Then Juno did the only thing in 11 hours she had done for anyone. She stopped watching the door. She put her chin down on the burned, bandaged wreck of her forepaws, pointed her face at Tess Vane, and let out a breath that went all the way down to the floor. She still did not eat. But at the 3rd hour, when Tess's voice finally ran dry, and the girl just sat there with her head tipped back against the wall, the dog dragged herself, splint and all, ignoring 40 kilos of medical engineering meant to prevent exactly this, across the bay, and laid the full weight of her ruined head on Tess's boot. Not affection, Reska's heat pits read it plainly, and she put it in the chart in plain words because the truth was clinical, even when it was terrible. The animal had assessed every being left available to her and posted herself to the one that smelled most like home. In the corridor afterward, Tess stood with her back against the wall and cried for exactly 1 minute, with discipline, the way Reska had seen humans do, as if grief were a valve you opened a calibrated amount. Then she wiped her face and said, "There's a thing you need to know about the harness. It's in pieces. We had to cut it, not the harness itself." Tess held up the sealed effects bag. Inside, with the steel tag and the cut straps, was a work glove, human-sized right hand, leather palm worn to a shine. This was clipped to her chest strap when she came in. Dogs like her, the handler clips a scent article on if they ever have to work apart, so the dog can refine them, the recovery crew said. Tess pressed her lips together. They said when they took Dell out, she had his glove in her mouth. She let them have him. She wouldn't let them have the glove. Somebody finally just clipped it where she could feel it, and she stood down. Reska looked at the glove a long time. "It goes in her bay," she said finally. "Whatever the contamination protocols, think about it. Log it as a prosthetic." By morning, the story was all over the Crossvin and most of Redgate. The Deathworld animal in recovery 4, the surgery nobody would do, the waiting room that had emptied itself like a lung. Othic's incident report went up the chain before first light, factual and fair and devastating, and the reply that came down by mid-morning carried a stamp Reska had only seen on quarantine orders. The Office of Animal Standards, Redgate Colonial Administration, had reviewed the intake of 1 Deathworld origin canid, ownership lapsed, and found that under Statute 11, the one written 40 years ago when the first human freighter started asking for births, an unclaimed Deathworld class animal could not remain in general population on Mall. It would be held under veterinary supervision only until transport could be arranged to the human enclave's off-world shipment point, and from there repatriated, crated to Earth jurisdiction. There was a freighter named the Corvain Lift on the schedule board. It departed in 31 days. Reska read the order 3 times, standing in the corridor outside Recovery 4, while on the other side of the glass a young woman who had now been on shift for 14 hours sat against the wall with a dog's head on her boot, both of them asleep, and the dog's thermal map showed its banked, lamp-dark center chest stillness slowly, very slowly, beginning to warm at the edge nearest the girl. 31 days, Reska thought, to heal a shattered animal, in a building that feared her, under a statute that wanted her gone, for a journey that would take her away from the one being she had chosen to live for. She went to find a fresh chart slate, It was going to be a long file. The first incident happened on day 6, and it set the pattern for everything after, which was this. Juno would do something no protocol on Mall could explain. Somebody would nearly die if she hadn't, and the paperwork would find a way to make it her fault. It was Imket's rotation, the slow hours after midnight. The intern had been pulling double shifts all week, partly devotion, partly because half the night staff had quietly arranged never to be in the wing that held Recovery 4, and somewhere in the 6th hour Imket's Mireille metabolism, which ran fast and hot and crashed faster, did what overworked Mireille metabolisms do. The intern went down the corridor to restock dressings and did not come back. The duty log showed what happened next in cold timestamps. At 0241, the latch on Recovery 4, which Imket had failed to seat fully on the last med check, clicked open under the steady pressure of a 40-kilo head. At 0242, motion sensors picked up the patient from Recovery 4 moving down the east corridor on a splinted leg she was under strict orders not to use. At 0244, the alarm board at the nurse's station lit up with a sound nobody on shift had ever heard before. A dog barking, deep and measured, in a hard, repeating pattern, 3 short, 1 long, 3 short, 1 long. Not frenzy, cadence. The night nurse, a cusk named Atra with 20 years of service and a documented terror of the patient in question, did the bravest thing of her career and followed the sound instead of locking herself in the dispensary. She found the intern face down by the dressing stores, membranes gray, deep in hypoglycemic shock, maybe 20 minutes from the kind of crash Mireille do not wake up from. Standing over the small body, not pacing, not howling, planted like a survey stake, barking that same hard 3-in-1, was the deathworld animal who, the moment Atra rounded the corner, stopped barking, backed exactly 2 paces off the intern, lay down with her splinted legs stretched out, and put her chin on the floor, making herself small. Making herself, Atra would say later in her statement, with an honesty that cost her, as unfrightening as 40 kilos of earth predator can be made, so that I would go past her to the child. So I did. Imket survived. By dawn, the story had gone around the building twice, and the 2 camps that would define the next month had already formed. Half the staff had begun, awkwardly leaving small offerings outside Recovery 4, a clean chew rope, a thermal blanket folded the way the dog liked. The other half had signed Othic's supplemental report, which noted, accurately, that a deathworld-class animal under containment statute had defeated her enclosure and moved unsupervised through a medical facility, and that outcome, however fortunate, is not a substitute for compliance. Tess read the survey service manual page out loud to anyone who would listen. The 3-in-1 was a casualty alert, drilled until it was reflex, the bark pattern a gas-and-ground dog gives over a downed human when she cannot leave them and help is in earshot. Juno had not defeated her enclosure and wandered. She had heard a being collapse 40 meters away through a closed door, gone to it on a broken leg, assessed it as her work, and called it in. She did her job, Tess said. Nobody here speaks her language is all. The Office of Animal Standards spoke its own language. The incident file landed on the desk of a containment officer named Kantrev Mole, and on day 8 Officer Mole came to the crossvine in person. A wide, careful cusk with administrator's plates and a slate full of statutes, who stood at the observation pane of Recovery 4 with the expression of a being confirming a fire hazard. Reska stood beside him and watched him watch the dog, Juno, healing at a rate that had forced Reska to reschedule the splint changes twice, lay on her pad with her chin on Del Arno's glove and watched the officer back, calm, unblinking, faintly disappointing him. It attacked no one. Mole said at last, sounding like a man reading an inconvenient instrument, noted. Officer's recommendation stands regardless. Early crating. There is a cargo run to the Enclave shipment point in 4 days, and my office sees no medical justification for this animal to remain in a civilian facility when her fracture lines are 11 days from load-bearing certification, her burn sites required debridement I will not delegate to a freight crew, and if you put her in a transport crate in her current condition, officer, my medical hold says she does not go. Reska heard the sentence leave her as one piece of engineering, no joints in it. The hold is filed. It renews at my clinical discretion. Statute 11 gives transport scheduling to your office and medical custody to mine. And medical custody decides fitness to travel. She is not fit. Mole's plate shifted, the slow cusk equivalent of a raised eyebrow. Your discretion has a horizon, surgeon. The Corvain lift leaves in 23 days. After that, it is a half year to the next earthbound hull, and the statute does not allow a half year. He made a notation. Renew your hold as you like. The crate is booked. He left. Reska stood at the pane a while longer. On the other side, the dog had stopped watching the door because the door had stopped mattering. Somewhere down the corridor, recognizable evidently by footstep alone through 2 walls, Tess Vane had come on shift. The dog's ears came up. The lamp-dark place in her thermal map the one Reska had been charting every day like weather over an ocean, had been shrinking by degrees every time the girl walked in, and it did it again now, visibly, a candle's worth, before Tess had even reached the wing. Reska went back to her office and opened the case file, and added a line to the running problem list, beneath the fractures and the burns and the smoke scarring, in her own private shorthand for the thing no statute on Mall had a column for. Problem 5, she wrote. The patient has decided where home is. The schedule disagrees. Rehabilitation began on day 10 because the patient made it begin. Reska arrived for morning rounds to find Juno standing fully, squarely. Weight on all 4 feet, including the one that should not have tolerated it for another week, at the door of Recovery 4, Splint held off the ground when she chose, planted when she chose, in flat defiance of every projection in the chart. The fracture lines, imaged that afternoon, had done in 10 days what Grohl Bone did in 40. Imkit, restored and devoted, and now more or less permanently assigned to the case by their own refusal to leave it, looked at the scans and said what the whole building was learning to say in its different dialects of awe and alarm. Surgeon, what is Earth like? That it builds them like this? Expensive, Tess said from the doorway. Earth is expensive. Everything there costs, so everything that lives is built not to pay. She had a lead rope coiled over her shoulder and a slate signed by Reska that made what they were about to do technically legal. Ready, big girl? The protocols for exercising a deathworld-class animal under containment statute ran to 9 pages. Officer Mole had supplied them personally. Double lead, 2 handlers minimum, muzzle rated for the species, route pre-filed, public areas prohibited. Tess had read all 9 pages, and then Reska had signed a clinical exemption to the muzzle, burn scarring at the jaw margins, fitting contraindicated, true as far as it went, and they had both decided not to test the public areas clause yet. The crossven had a service yard. Half a hectare of packed pale dirt between the kennel wing and the feed barns, fenced dusty daylit. It would do. What Reska expected from the first walk was a medical event. What she got was a lesson in what the word working meant on Earth. Out of the harness, the new harness Enclave bought, with Del Arno's glove folded and zip-bound flat against the chest strap where the dog could feel it. Juno was a convalescent. She moved carefully, slept hugely, leaned her shoulder into Tess's knee at rest with a slow gravity that made the girl plant her feet. The moment the harness buckled, something through the whole animal changed pitch. The head came up and leveled. The gait organized itself around the splint instead of apologizing for it. She quartered the yard once, nose down, in neat survey lines nobody had asked for, and then she came back to Tess's left side and sat and looked up. And the look was a question, and the question was, assignment? She's clocked on, Tess said quietly. Del said it like that. Harness on, she's on shift. She looked down at the dog looking up at her, and Reska watched the girl's thermal map do its flare and steady. She thinks I'm her shift lead now. Juno, I muck out kennels. The dog held the look. Tess's voice came out not quite even. Okay, she said, heel. And the dog rose and fell in at her knee like a key going into a lock. After that, the yard sessions ran twice a day, and Reska attended everyone she could, officially to monitor the limb, actually because it was the only hour of her schedule that made the rest of it bearable. Day by day, the splint came down to a brace, and the brace came down to a wrap. Tess worked through the survey service command set out of Dell's manual. The Enclave Labor Office had released his effects to the hospital as items pertaining to the welfare of the animal. A kindness Reska suspected a particular young woman had argued for at volume, and the dog executed each command with a precision that made the manual look like it had been written about her. Heel, stand, down, stay, range out, mark, and return. The 3-in-1 casualty alert on command, which the first time Tess drilled it, brought half the kennel wing staff out of the building at a run, and which thereafter was drilled at posted hours by general request. It should have been idyllic, and for about 6 days it nearly was. And Reska knew enough about schedules and statutes to distrust every hour of it. The crate was still booked. The hold was still temporary. She charted the limb's progress with a strange double feeling, because every degree of soundness she certified was a degree of fitness to travel, and fitness to travel meant the Corvain lift, and the lift meant a sealed crate and a half-year passage to a planet where nobody was waiting for this dog at all. The better her work went, the faster it destroyed itself. She did not put that in the chart. It was in the chart anyway, between every line. And there was the other thing, the thing she had started keeping a private log of, because it was not clinical, and it would not leave her alone. The dog leaned north-northwest. Not always. On shift in harness working Tess's commands, she was a closed system, flawless. But at rest, at the yard fence in the cooling late afternoon, on the pad in Recovery 4 when the building went quiet, the dog would point herself, with the casual exactness of a compass needle pretending to be asleep, toward the same bearing. Reska checked it against the colony grid the third time she noticed. North-northwest of the crossvein lay 11 kilometers of scrub, the perimeter road, and the Cardin Combine's geothermal field. Bore 4. The ground that had her handler's blood in it. She's not trying to go, Tess said when Reska finally showed her the log. They were at the yard fence. The dog lay at the girl's feet, nose to the wire, pointed at the horizon like a verdict. If she wanted to go, believe me, this fence is a suggestion. Tess searched for it. On the farm where I grew up, my grand's old collie did this when a storm was coming. Hours early, she'd lie in the yard and face it, not scared. Just keeping it where she could see it. The girl looked at the scrub line, at the nothing there. What's she facing, you figure? Her handler died on that bearing, Reska said. I assumed grief has a geography. Tess didn't sound convinced, and what she said next stayed in Reska's private log for good. Gas and ground dog, though. Dell used to say the planet talks all day, and Juno's the only one on the contract who never stops listening. She scratched the dog's ear. The compass needle did not move. I'd give a lot to know what it's saying to her. Day 17 gave them all a piece of the answer, although nobody could read it yet, and the price of the lesson was nearly 2 lives and 1 signature on a complaint form. The Crossveen's feed and cold stores ran along the service yard's north side, a row of insulated bays, lease storage, contractor traffic in and out all morning. Bay 9 held veterinary cold chain stock, Syrah, cultured grafts, behind a heavy thermal door, chilled by a refrigerant loop as old as the building. The contractor who serviced the row was a cusk named Dorvek Heil, broad and brisk and loudly unafraid of the deathworld animal, a point he made every time he crossed the yard, in the way of beings who are exactly as afraid as everyone else and have chosen volume as their containment strategy. At the mid-morning session, Juno broke heel. She had never done it, not once, not for a drop feed pan, not for the Kennel Wing's frantic morning chorus, not for the freight drones that came over the fence line at rooftop height. Tess was running her through range and return when the dog came back from the range leg, did not return to the mark, and instead planted herself in front of the man door of Bay 9, directly in front of it, square to it, facing Dorvik Heil and his service cart at a distance of 3 meters, and stood. There was no growl. Reska was 20 paces away, and her heat pits were on the dog the whole time, and she would write it in 3 separate statements before the month was out. No growl, no raised hackle, no bared teeth, at no point any posture of attack. Just 40 kilos of earth predator standing square in front of a door, perfectly still, perfectly calm, declining to be elsewhere. To Dorvik Heil's credit, he tried to laugh. Move your animal, human, I have a schedule. Juno heel, Tess said. The dog's ears acknowledged her. Her feet did not. Juno heel, nothing. The dog looked at Tess, and Reska swore she saw, logged that she saw. The conflict crossed the animal in a single shiver from ears to tail. The command against the assignment. Then Juno did the thing that ended up in the training literature of 2 species. Caught between her handler's order and whatever her own senses were screaming, she split the difference with a precision no protocol anywhere had taught her. She walked to Tess, took the girl's sleeve in her mouth with the pressure of a being lifting an egg, drew her, gently, irresistibly, 40 kilos of insistence wrapped in absolute softness, 4 steps back from the bay door, released the sleeve, and went back and stood in front of the door again. Get the surgeon, Tess said very quietly, to Imkit at the fence. Something's wrong with that bay. What was wrong with Bay 9, the hazard crew established 90 minutes later, after Dorvik Heil had shouted and filed and stood on the dignity of his schedule. After Officer Mole had been called by someone before the hazard crew had been called by anyone, a sequencing Reska noted carefully was a refrigerant line that had been weeping coolant vapor into the sealed, sun-warmed bay for days. The compound was odorless to Cusk. It was odorless to Mireille, to Vethrin, to every species with regular business in that yard. Heavier than air, it had pooled waist-deep behind the thermal door, at a concentration the crew chief described, with the flat voice of a being doing arithmetic about himself, as immediately incapacitating. Dorvik Heil's morning schedule had him in that bay, door swinging shut behind his cart for a 40-minute stock rotation. 2 Grolan calves in the adjoining bay, separated by a ventilation grate, were found drowsy and staggering and were carried out into the daylight and survived. The dog had smelled it through an insulated door from the middle of a working yard over the ordinary stink of feed and dust and disinfectant, and had identified, out of every being in that yard, the one whose schedule was about to kill him. It was, Reska thought, the kind of fact that should have ended every argument on Maul. She was learning by then how facts actually traveled through institutions. Dorvik Heil, alive specifically because of an animal he had been 3 meters from dying in spite of, was a man of paperwork, and shame is a powerful co-author. His complaint stood. It said the deathworld animal left handler control, defied direct commands, physically seized a colonial resident, the sleeve. The form had a box for contact and no box for gentleness, and obstructed contracted works. Every word of it was true. That was the genius of the form. Officer Mole attached the hazard report as context, attached Reska's statement as context, attached Atra's and Imkit's and Tess's statements as context, and forwarded the lot to the colonial administration with his recommendation unchanged, and now twice underlined. An animal whose interventions could not be predicted, commanded, or explained was not safer because the interventions kept being correct. It was a wild variable in a colony's risk ledger. Crate. That evening, Reska found Tess at the yard fence in the long gold light, the dog at her feet pointed north-northwest. Dell had a word for this, Tess said, without preamble. When she alerted and the readings disagreed with her and you had to choose, he wrote it in the manual margins like 10 places. Trust the dog, the data's slow. She let a breath out through her teeth. Twice now she's known, the intern, the bay. Both times the paperwork came out worse for her than if she'd lain there and let it happen. Surgeon, what happens when she knows a third time? Reska watched the dog watch the horizon. 11 kilometers north-northwest. The Cardin Combine's perimeter beacons were starting to blink against the dusk, one by one, marking the ground where everything in this case had begun. She did not have an answer for the girl that wasn't a statute. The statute had a crate in it. A third time, Reska said, we make sure the right beings are watching. The third time came on day 22, in the middle of Redgate's market terraces, in front of approximately 400 witnesses, and the right beings were watching, and it still nearly wasn't enough. The outing itself was Reska's doing, and she owned that in every document afterward. The Survey Service Rehabilitation Standard, Del Arno's own manual, the only qualified text on the planet, was explicit. A working canine recovering from trauma had to be reproofed in crowds, noise, and traffic before recertification, or the trauma set into the temperament like a fault line. Whatever waited at the end of the Corvain lift's half-year passage, Reska reasoned, a sound dog would survive it better than a broken one. So she filed the route, posted the notice, signed the exemptions, and accepted Officer Mole's condition without argument. Mole himself would attend with 2 containment wardens at a discreet distance, equipped. Redgate's market ran along 3-step terraces above the old flood channel, daylit, under sail shades, loud with commerce in 4 languages. The crowd's reaction to the dog moved through it like weather, a bow wave of silence, then the murmur closing behind. Vendors froze mid-transaction. A drover's string of pack Grolan did something pack Grolan never do, which was stop arguing. On the upper terrace a Velhound, a different Velhound, Maul had no shortage, took the air once and lay down flat between its owner's feet, without being told, and stayed there watching Juno pass, the way sentries watch a general's transport. Nothing personal, everything structural. And the dog worked. That was the thing Reska kept returning to in memory all the days after. Through the noise and the press and the fierce stink of 100 beings, and the Grolan bawling in a freight drone's shadow, strobing the shades. Through all of it, Juno held Tess's left knee like a bearing in a machine, checked in at the turns, ignored a dropped fry basket that bounced off the path a meter away, executed 2 downstays in the middle of the current of the crowd while Tess bought feed tags she didn't need. 22 days from a collapsed gallery and half her blood gone into the dirt of Bore 4, and the manual's hardest proofing course might as well have been the service yard. Imkit, walking the second lead and beaming like a being at a graduation, said it for everyone. She's going to pass everything. They're going to crate her anyway, and she's going to pass everything first. Then they came down the ramp toward the flood channel crossing, and the dog stopped. The crossing was a culvert cap, a span of graded deck plate, 12 meters of it, bridging the old channel where it tunneled under the lowest terrace. Beneath it ran the colony's heat exchange return, the home leg of the same, geothermal loop whose far end was the Cardon Field, 11 kilometers north-northwest. The grate carried foot traffic all day, every day. It was carrying it now. Porters, vendors, a knot of Mireille schoolchildren on a rest day outing, 14 of them, small and membrane bright and herded by 2 adults, strung out across the span like beads off a snapped cord. Juno's head went up, and Reska, 3 paces back, 8 pits open, watched the whole animal change state, not the bay door stillness, something with voltage in it. The dog's ears swiveled once across the span, her nose dropped to the deck plate, and then she did the thing that 400 witnesses would describe in 400 ways, and that the containment warden's own body cams would record in one way, which was this. She crossed the span at a dead run, low and silent, straight at the children. Somebody screamed. Of course somebody screamed. Reska heard it and felt the whole terrace pivot toward the sound, felt 400 versions of the same story every being on Maul had been raised on, suddenly looking for a place to happen. The warden's hands went to their launchers. Officer Mole's voice came up, hold. hold, and Reska would credit him for that one word for the rest of her career. The dog did not touch a single child. She arrived ahead of them, between them in the middle of the span, and turned and became a wall. Shoulder first, broadside, head low and swinging, she walked into the group the way a gate closes, body checking nothing, biting nothing, simply occupying, step by step, every path forward. While her bark, the third sound, the one nobody but Tess had heard before, rolled across the terraces. Not 3 in 1. A continuous, deep, metronomic alarm, the gas alert, the get off the ground now voice, and the children, who had no training and no language in common with her, understood it the way prey species understand weather and went where she pushed them. Back, off the span, up the ramp, stumbling, crying, herded all 14, the 2 adults swept along with them, while Tess ran the lead out behind her shouting the one useful thing, "Off the grate? She wants you off the grate. Move." And the crowd, God help it, moved. Juno came off the span last. She cleared the final feeder of deck plate at 11:42:17 by the warden's body cam clock. At 11:42:31, 14 seconds later, the culvert vented. The official sequence, assembled over the following days from the utility logs, was almost insultingly mundane. A pressure relief stage on the heat exchange return, 11 kilometers upstream in the Carden field, had hung up on a faulted valve. The fault had been logged by the automatics and queued low priority for the next maintenance window. Line pressure had climbed for 6 hours. At 11:42, the relief finally let go all at once, and a slug of superheated vapor traveled the return at the speed of a freight hauler and blew the emergency standpipes along the flood channel, including the 2 that flanked the culvert cap, which erupted through the grating in twin columns of steam that scalded the sail shades off their rigging 8 meters overhead. The deck plate where 14 children had been standing held a surface temperature 90 seconds later that the hazard crew measured and then measured again because nobody believed the first number. No one died. 2 porters at the span's far end were treated for steam burns and released. 14 Mireille children went home to 14 Mireille households and told them what the earth animal had done, in the unimprovable words of the young, and that, more than any statement Reska ever filed, was what split the colony down the middle, because it did split. Reska had imagined, for 14 seconds at a market crossing, that this, public, recorded, undeniable children would end the argument. She underestimated how much certain parties needed the argument not to end. The first sign was the broadcast panel that evening. A colonial administration risk assessor, flanked by a sleek being Reska did not yet recognize, explaining patiently that the animal could not have known, that canids did not predict utility failures, that the sequence was coincidence garlanded with hindsight, that what the footage actually showed, stripped of sentiment, was an uncontrolled deathworld predator charging a group of children in a public market. Outcome fortunate, conduct catastrophic. The sleek being was introduced as Director Savin Roque of the Carden Combine, present, because the vapor event had originated in Combine infrastructure and the Combine wished to be transparent. Director Roque said the words regrettable single-point mechanical fault 4 times in 3 minutes. He had the smooth, well-watered calm of a creature whose risk ledger's always balanced, and he expressed gravely his concern that public attention was being directed at an animal when the colony deserved a serious conversation about aging utilities. He announced, in the same breath, that the Combine would be funding a full third-party audit and that the much-delayed Bore 7 expansion, new capacity, modern line 600 jobs, would proceed on schedule with a groundbreaking ceremony in 9 days to which all of Redgate was warmly invited. Tess watched the broadcast in the staff room with her arms folded so tight her knuckles paled. 11 kilometers of pipe between the fault and that grate, she said. 6 hours of pressure climb, and she called it from the deck plate with her nose. Surgeon, what was she calling? Not the valve. You can't smell a valve. Reska had been turning the same question over since 11:42:17. The line itself, she said slowly. If the return is old, if it seeps, microfractures, joint weeps, trace gas riding the steam. A nose that found one weeping coolant line through an insulated door. Stopped, because the next thought arrived with a bearing attached, and the bearing was north-northwest. She has been pointing at that field for 3 weeks. I assumed it was grief. Specialist vein. What was your handler surveying at Bore 4? The day he died. They pulled the contract scope that night, Tess's enclave credentials opening the public registry, and read it together in the empty staff room. Redgate Contract 7, Geological and Atmospheric Assessment, Carden Geothermal Lease, Sections 4 through 9. Assessment in support of proposed expansion. Del Arno had spent his last 8 months walking the Combine's old field with a gas and ground dog, measuring whether the rock that held the colony's heat could take strain of more. His final report carried no filing date. His final report, The registry said in the gray font of things nobody is meant to notice was never submitted. Contract terminated by fatality. Deliverables incomplete. File closed. Closed, Tess repeated. Her voice had gone very quiet and very level, and the dog, lying across her feet under the staff room table, lifted her head at it. He worked that survey like it was chasing him the last month. No market days. I didn't. She pressed her hands flat on the table. He knew something was wrong out there. He died in it. And his data died with him. And in 9 days, they're going to set percussion charges in the same rock. And the only living thing on this planet that finished that survey has 4 legs and a crate booked with her name on it. In the silence after, Reska's heat pits read the room without her asking them to, the girl burning steady and furious. The dog's map with its lamp-dark grief banked low, and laid over it now something Reska had watched grow for 3 weeks without naming it, a fixed orientation, an unfinished arrow, 11 kilometers long. The deliverables aren't incomplete, Reska said. They're buried. She stood and reached for her slate, and discovered her decision already made, the way her hands sometimes finished sutures before she planned them. A survey dog's field data, where would it live? Cache units. Hardened ones, they're built to survive. Tess stopped. To survive a collapse. Dell carried the day's takes on his belt and synced to a base cache at the site office every night. The recovery crew released his personal effects. There was no belt unit on the list. It's still in the ground. She was already standing. Or it's wherever he put it when the wall started to go. He had time to put her out. The crew said that, did I tell you? The geometry of where they found him. He was behind her. He'd thrown her clear of the slip and the second fall caught him instead. And that's why, for the first time since the night at the observation glass, the girl's discipline failed her for more than a minute, and the dog rose and pressed her whole weight against her. And Reska looked away from both of them and out the window, north-northwest, and let them have it. Then she opened a new form on her slate. Clinical justification, site-specific desensitization, final stage of trauma rehabilitation protocol, return of working animal to incident location under controlled conditions, surgeon attending. It was even true. It was simply not the whole truth, and Reska found, examining herself with some interest, that she could live with that. We have 9 days, she said. Tomorrow we take her back to Bor 4. They loaded the hauler at dawn, and dawn had brought visitors. Word of the transport rescheduling had moved through the lower terraces overnight, the way everything moved through Redgate, by Market Stall and School Queue, and the cross-vein service gate had grown a small, strange reef of objects against its base. A knotted pull rope of the kind Murray weavers made for their own beasts, a clay water bowl glazed new, with a name painted on it in careful trade script lettering by a hand that had clearly practiced. A dried sweetgrass braid that Groland drovers hung for luck on animals they wanted the ground to be kind to. No notes. Most of the species of mall did not leave notes. They left things, and the things said it. Atra carried the bowl in herself and washed it twice and put it in the hauler with the medkits, daring anyone to comment. And as they pulled out through the gate, Reska saw, standing at the staff entrance in the flat early light, Surgeon Prime Othik, who had filed every report, signed every concern, complied with every statute, and who now watched the hauler pass with his plates unreadable, and raised one armored hand, not quite a wave, more the gesture a being makes toward a ship leaving harbor in weather. Acknowledgement of what Othik's own letter would eventually say better than Othik ever managed out loud. The Carden field at mid-morning was bright and dead. That was Reska's first impression, and it never improved. 11 kilometers out from Redgate, the scrub gave way to graded service roads and pipe. Galleries running in silver lines to the horizon, heat shimmer standing over the exchange stacks, and nothing alive anywhere that hadn't been brought in a vehicle. The site office at Bor 4 had been demobilized after the collapse. Sealed, powered down, a combine incident placard on the door promising a remediation schedule. The bore mouth itself was a fenced scar in the hillside, the gallery behind it half-swallowed raw rock and snapped shoring visible in the throat of it, and a fresh berm of spoil where the recovery crews had dug. They had come in a cross-vein utility hauler, 4 of them, Reska driving, Tess. Imkit with the field med kit nobody discussed, and the dog. Officer Mole knew the route was filed. The filing said rehabilitation. The perimeter gate's lease board, mercifully, recognized the hospital's hazard response transponder from the vapor event investigation and let them through without a call to anyone. Reska logged the time anyway. She had stopped pretending to herself that this was deniable. Juno rode the last kilometer standing up, braced against Tess's knee, and the sound she made when the bore mouth came into view was not a bark. It was low and continuous, and it came from somewhere in the architecture of her chest, and Tess put a hand on her, and the sound steadied but did not stop. Protocol says we let her work it, Tess said quietly. Dell's manual. Return to incident ground, harness on, give her the site like an assignment. If she breaks down, you pull her out and she's done, retired. You don't ask again. If she works, the girl's jaw set. She works. They put the harness on at the fence line. The change came down over the animal like a visor. The trembling stopped, the chest sound stopped, the head leveled. Tess unclipped the lead, stood beside her at the edge of her handler's grave ground and said, "Juno, range out. Mark." What the dog did in the next 90 minutes, Reska's heat pits and Imkit's sight camera recorded between them, and the file built from those records went further across the galaxy, in the end, than any other document Reska ever signed. The dog quartered the bore apron in survey lines so exact that Imkit, overlaying them later on Del Arno's filed grid from the contract scope, found them matching his stake pattern to the half-meter. The dog had walked this ground with her handler so many times his methodology lived in her feet. She marked 4 points along the pipe gallery, each with the trained two-paw stamp, and sit that the manual called a chemical flag, each flag noted, photographed, sampled by Imkit with the hand pump kit from the hauler. She passed the bore mouth itself with her ears flat and her line unbroken 3 times. And Reska, watching the animal's map, saw the lamp-dark grief flare hugely and the discipline hold it down and looked away, because some kinds of courage shame the witness. And then, at the gallery's collapsed end, at the place where the recovery berm met the rock, the dog stopped ranging. She stood for a long moment, nose working. She looked back at Tess, one look, the assignment look, asking, and Tess, white-face, gave her the word, and Juno went up the spoil and along the slip face to a fissure where the second fall had wedged against the old relief manifold, and began, very deliberately, to dig. Easy, Imkit started forward. Reska put out an arm. It took 11 minutes. Nobody timed it on purpose. The camera did. 11 minutes of methodical, untiring, terribly familiar digging. This is how she dug for him, Reska thought, hour 11 of 11, and made herself watch. And then the dog backed out of the cut she'd made, gripping something in her jaws with egg-lifting softness, and came down the spoil and crossed to Tess and sat, and delivered into the girl's cupped hands a scratched, dirt-caked, fist-sized cylinder of orange composite, a survey cache unit, field-hardened, belt-clipped, its tethers snapped. The geometry told the story plainer than any inquest. The fissure sat behind and above the point where the recovery crew had found Del Arno's body. He had not been caught fleeing. In the seconds the wall gave him, he had thrown his dog clear and turned, and wedged 8 months of data into the deepest crack he could reach, and put himself between the second fall and both of the things he had decided mattered more than he did. Tess sat down on the spoil of her friend's grave with the cache in her hands and the dog's head against her chest, and Reska and Imkit walked back to the hauler and inventoried the medkit twice, slowly, until the two of them came down. The cache opened that evening in the Crossveen staff room. Under enclave encryption keys, the labor office surrendered when Tess invoked the survivor data clause of Dell's contract, the one provision the Combine's lawyers had evidently never imagined anyone reading. The unit held 240 days of field takes, and the last 30 of them were a man arguing with a mountain in numbers. Imkit, who had grown up around mining stock and read stratigraphs the way others read menus, walked them through it, membranes flattening further with every screen. The Cardenfield's deep rock was tired. 40 years of heat mining had dried and stressed the old galleries, and somewhere under sections 6 through 9, gas, stray methane analog seep, the planet's own slow exhalation, harmless while it stayed diffuse, had been gathering in the fractured strata the way Dell's margin notes said it would. Pressurizing, pocket by pocket, against the day, something shook it loose. His acoustic takes showed the rock talking louder month by month. His air chemistry takes showed the seep climbing. Juno's flagged alerts, he logged each one, date, location, her behavior scored, drew a tightening ring around the very sections the expansion was bought to exploit. The last completed entry, time-stamped 9 days before the collapse, was a draft stop work advisory addressed to the Combine Site Directorate, recommending suspension of all percussion work pending deep survey, flagged urgent, never sent, and beneath it, the auto log of a comm call to the site office, 14 minutes the day before he died. The transcript field said only, verbal summary delivered. Response, noted, survey to continue per schedule, advisory to follow in writing. He had told them out loud. With 14 minutes of his last full day, he had told them, and the next morning the gallery wall at Bore 4, pressurized, fractured, exactly as his data said, had let go on top of him, and the Combine had logged it operator misadventure, closed the contract, and rebooked the charges. And in 8 days, Tess said into the silence, they fire percussion strings into Section 7, which is here. She put her finger on the brightest ring of the dog's flagged alerts. 11 kilometers from town, on a heat exchange loop that runs under the market terraces. We have to. She looked up at Reska, Who do we even take this to? They took it to everyone, and that was the education of Reskaven's surgeon in how a colony actually works. The Utilities Directorate received the cash copy with genuine alarm and referred it to the Colonial Administration because lease compliance was not theirs. The administration's compliance office received it and referred it to the magistrate's bench because contested contractor data was evidentiary. The magistrate, Magistrate Unwer, an old Vorn with a reputation for fairness and a docket like a landslide, granted them a hearing in 4 days, which was to say 4 days before the groundbreaking, and listened and was not unmoved, and then the Combine's counsel rose and did exactly what Reska had been told corporate counsel would do, with exactly the smoothness of a being doing it for the 100th time. The data, counsel observed, was unfilled draft material from a terminated contract, recovered without Combine authorization from a sealed incident site. The hospital's transponder logs were produced. Reska watched her own carefully recorded timestamps turn around in counsel's hands like a knife being passed back blade first by parties with a documented emotional investment in a particular animal's disposition. The chain of custody ran through a dog. The advisory was a draft the surveyor himself had elected not to submit. The 14-minute call had no transcript. Dead men's margins were not testimony. The Combine, counsel continued, had every confidence in its own engineering review, which found the expansion section sound. It deeply regretted the surveyor's death, which the existing finding adequately explained. And it noted with concern that the beings now circulating alarmist material had also, that same week, been the subject of multiple conduct complaints regarding the deathworld class animal in their charge. And then, in a coda delivered so gently it took the room a moment to feel the temperature drop, counsel observed that the Combine had become aware that the animal's medical hold was being renewed on a rehabilitation rationale even as the same party certified her field capable enough to conduct quasi-surveys at industrial sites. That this contradiction had been brought to the attention of the Office of Animal Standards and the Veterinary Licensing Board, and that the Standards Office had, that morning, in light of the animal's demonstrated fitness, rescheduled her transport. Not the Corvain lift, in 8 days. A Combine chartered cargo run to the Enclave shipment point, departing in 3, generously offered, counsel said, to spare the colony further incident at the Combine's own expense. Magistrate Unwer took the cash data under advisement, declined to enjoin the groundbreaking on the record before her, scheduled a full evidentiary review for the following month, and ruled that she had no jurisdiction over a transport order lawfully issued under Statute 11. The following month, Reska stood in the corridor outside the hearing room doing arithmetic that didn't need doing. The charges fired in 4 days. The crate left in 3. The review would convene on the rubble of whichever way the Rock decided to vote. Officer Cantrev Mole was waiting by the public doors, plates dark, holding his slate like a being holding someone else's verdict. To his credit, and Reska was keeping by then an honest ledger of the credit of Cantrev Mole, he did not look pleased. Surgeon, the rescheduled order. I didn't request it. I know, Reska said, it requested you. I have processed 11 Deathworld class repatriations in this office. Mole's voice stayed flat, administrative. Only the plates gave him away. Every one of them was an animal nobody wanted. This is the first one where I've had 14 households of Myray parents in my public queue asking how to file an objection, and a feed contractor, the same contractor whose complaint is still open on my desk, asking whether withdrawing it would slow anything down. He looked at her. It won't. I want it noted that I told him to file the withdrawal anyway. Noted, Reska said, and meant it like a surgeon means it permanently in the chart. 3 days, Surgeon Venn. The crate arrives at your facility tomorrow for veterinary inspection. The charter loads from the freight apron at Lowfield, 0800, day after next. He paused, and the next thing he said carefully, a being placing a single weight on the far side of a scale he was supposed to be guarding. Statute 11 applies to unclaimed animals. It is always applied to unclaimed animals. My office has never had cause to examine what the Enclave's Working Animal Registry considers a claim, because in 40 years no human has ever stood at my counter and made one. You might mention that to your staff, as trivia. He was gone before Reska could answer. She found Tess and Imkit on the hall's public bench, the dog in a downstay between them, with her chin on the girl's boot, and relayed it word for word. Tess was very still for a moment. The registry, she said. Dell's registration. A Survey K9 isn't property. She's enrolled. Handler of record like a partnership. I never qualified. I'm not anything. I muck out kennels. She stopped herself, and Reska watched the girl's map flare and steady, the coal getting breathed on. The registry has a transfer provision. Handler of record deceased. It needs the service examiner to certify a successor handler. Field assessment. There's one examiner for this whole sector, And she sits at the enclave, 400 kilometers away, and the application needs. Tess was counting on her fingers now, fast. A sponsoring employer, a veterinary fitness certificate, and a demonstrated working bond assessed in person. Sponsoring employer, Reska said. The Crossveen Veterinary Trauma Hall has, as of this morning, a vacancy for a hazard detection consultant. I am told the facility surgeon writes very persuasive justifications. The fitness certificate I will sign tonight. She looked at the clock on the hall wall, did the arithmetic one more time, and felt the whole month assemble itself into a single closing window. The examiner is 400 kilometers away, the charter loads in 60 hours, and an in-person assessment of a deathworld class animal will require her to travel. Specialist vein. How fast can you write? The application went out that night under 3 signatures, Tessa's, Reska's, and appended in the morning with a covering note that managed to be both entirely procedural and quietly mutinous. Officer Kantrev Moles attaching, in his capacity as containment officer of record, his office's complete incident file. The intern, the bay, the culvert grate, 14 names of 14 children, the body cam clock, the dates, the bearings, every protocol the animal had broken, and every life that was walking around Redgate because she had broken it. The examiner's reply arrived 11 hours later, and it was 2 lines long. Assessment granted. I will be on the morning shuttle. Hold that animal on planet until I have seen her work. The crate arrived the same afternoon, which was the Combine's way of replying without writing anything down. It came on a flatbed with 2 charter crewmen and a manifest, and it was, Reska had to concede, a very good crate. Deathworld rated composite, climate loop, water dispenser, padded deck, observation panes, a half year of careful engineering, a beautifully built nowhere. Veterinary inspection of transport containment was the surgeon's legal duty, so Reska inspected it, in the service yard, in the long afternoon light, with the whole kennel wing finding reasons to be at windows. The protocol required the animal to demonstrate voluntary entry. Tess walked Juno to the open crate, and Reska watched the dog read the thing in one pass of the nose, the newness, the latch gauge, the shape of what it was, and then look up at Tess, not the assignment look. A simpler one, older, the one every working animal keeps in reserve for its person. Do I have to? Tess said, with her voice held level by main force, because the protocol had to be passed for the inspection to be signed, and an inspection failure was a sedated loading, and she would not let them have that. Juno. The dog stepped into the crate, turned around in it, lay down with her chin on her paws, and looked out at them through the pane. She did not whine, that was the worst of it. She regarded them from inside the box built to take her away from everything she had re-chosen to live for, calm, trusting, on shift, and Reska signed the inspection with a hand that wanted very much to write something else. And Tess said, out, too fast. And the dog came out and shook herself once, whole body, as if shedding water no one else could see. In the late afternoon, the children came. 14 of them, with their 2 adults, walking up the service road from the lower terraces in a line that had clearly been negotiated with several sets of parents, each child carrying nothing, which their teacher explained at the gate with great formality. The households had wished to send gifts, and the children had voted, and the children had ruled that she would rather have the visit. They stood along the yard fence in the gold light, and Tess brought Juno over off harness, off shift, the distinction the dog kept like a law, and for half an hour the most documented death world, predator in the sector lay against the wire being patted by 28 small hands, while the containment statute sat in its office, 4 kilometers away, saying whatever statutes say to empty rooms. The smallest one, the one who would later raise an arm over a cordon line and start a chant, pressed its face to the wire as the line reformed to leave, and asked the teacher in trade pidgin, loudly, with the deadly clarity of the very young, why the dog had to go in a box if she had done nothing wrong, and the teacher, an honest being, looked at the humans on the other side of the fence and did not manufacture an answer, and that, Reska wrote in her log that night, was the whole month, in one exchange at child height. That evening, Officer Mole's office posted the final transport notice, and the Combine's public channel confirmed, in the same hour, that in view of favorable engineering review, the Bore 7 program would advance its preliminary calibration shots to the following morning. 900 a day ahead of the ceremony, a technical formality, charges at 1/10 program load, no public access required. Imkit read the notice twice and went very still. They moved the shots inside the review window. The magistrate's evidentiary review, if the calibration strings fire and nothing happens, that's their engineering case made in public, before anyone rules on a dead man's data. They're using the ground itself as a witness. They are detonating charges, Reska said slowly, in fractured, gas-charged strata to win an argument, at 1/10 load. Imkit's membranes flattened. Surgeon, you've read the same takes I have. The pockets under Section 7 don't grade on load. The last night, nobody planned. It simply assembled itself the way the important ones do. Reska stayed late with a case file open and found she had nothing to add to it and kept it open anyway. Imkett fell asleep in the staff room mid-shift and no one woke them. And Tess Vane sat on the floor of Recovery 4 with her back against the wall, in the spot 2 meters from the pad beside the door, where she had first sat down 26 days ago and changed the disposition of every being in the building. Reska was in the corridor. She would always be honest in her own log about why. She was checking the thermal map one more time, the way you check a closing wound, and so she saw it happen through the observation pane and wrote it down within the hour and never read the entry afterward without feeling the room go quiet around her again. The dog rose from the pad, unhurried. She went to the corner of the bay where her things lived, the chew rope, the folded blanket, the harness on its low peg, and she worked the zip binding of the chest strap with her teeth, deliberately taking her time until the worn leather glove came free, Del Arno's glove, the scent article. The object she had carried out of the ground in her mouth while they took everything else. The thing she had kept between herself and the world for 26 days, the way other creatures keep their own heartbeat. She picked it up with that egg-lifting softness, and she crossed the bay, and she laid it in Tess Vane's lap. Then she sat and looked at the girl and waited. Tess did not move for a long moment. When she did, it was to take the glove in both hands and bow her head over it, and the sound she made was small and ruinous, and the dog leaned in and pressed her brow against the girl's brow and held there, 40 kilos of Earth's worst nightmare, standing perfectly still in a lamplit room, giving away the last of one love to make room for the next. In the corridor, Surgeon Reska Venn, 9 years of theater discipline, a species whose faces do not weep, pressed her hand flat against the observation glass and stood watch, and let no one else into that wing until morning. The examiner's shuttle came in at first light, and the day that followed entered colonial record under a case number, an inquest seal, and, in the Enclave's own informal usage, a name, the 9th of Greenmonth, the Lowfield Cascade. Examiner Hadley proved to be a compact human woman with 40 years of working dogs behind her eyes, who shook no hands, accepted no refreshment, read Mull's incident file standing up in the Crossvein lobby and said, "Yard now. The charter does not load until I say it loads, and I have told the charter so." In the yard, she put Tess and Juno through the assessment battery at a pace that gave nothing and forgave nothing. Obedience under distraction, blind Heller trust work, scent discrimination on planted samples, the casualty alert, the gas alert, control at distance, recall through chaos that Imkett and 3 volunteer orderlies were instructed to manufacture with feed pans and a siren. Reska watched from the men's with Officer Mull, who had arrived without being summoned, in full uniform, carrying the transport order he was charged with executing like a man carrying something he hoped to be relieved of. "She's green," Hadley said flatly to Tess at the battery's midpoint in everyone's hearing. "You, not the dog. Your leash handling's enclave amateur and your field voice needs 2 years of work." She made a notation. "The dog doesn't care. I have examined 940 handler bonds. I test for the thing money can't train, which is whether the animal has decided. This animal would hold a downstay for you in a burning building." She looked at the bearing of the dog's ears then and frowned, because for the last several minutes, the records would fix it at 12 minutes before the first event. Juno's downstay had been flawless, and her ears had not been in it. They were locked north-northwest. "What's out there?" "The Carden field," Tess said. 4-7. "They're firing calibration strings at 09. The dog stood up out of the downstay. "In 940 assessments," Examiner Hadley said later, under oath at the inquest, "I have failed animals for breaking a stay without release. I did not fail this one, because in 40 years I have learned the difference between a dog that breaks and a dog that overrides." She came up out of that stay like a system completing a measurement, and she gave the gas alert at full voice on a bearing of north-northwest. And then she turned to her handler and gave the casualty alert, 3-1, 3-1, which her service trains to mean beings down, and which she gave that morning before a single being on this planet was down. I noted the time, 08:51. Then she looked her handler in the face and ran for the gate, and stopped, and looked back, and I am on record at the inquest, and I will say it here. The animal was not fleeing. The animal was recruiting. At 8:53, 11 kilometers north-northwest, 94 seconds ahead of schedule, because a site engineer's countdown had drifted and no one saw a reason to resync a formality, the Carden Combine fired 6 calibration strings into the floor of Section 7. The planet answered. Del Arno's data had mapped the pockets. The pockets had kept filling for the 200 days since. The string's 1/10 load did exactly what Imkett had said load would not decide either way. It asked the strata a question, and the strata, fractured and dried and 40 years tired, gas charge beyond every margin in the Combine's sleek engineering review, gave its answer all at once. The seam under Section 7 let go along 400 meters of gallery in a rolling subsurface vent that the seismographs at the enclave, 400 kilometers away, recorded as a shallow quake. The bore field stacks blew their relief arrays in sequence like a string of struck matches, and the pressure front, with nowhere else to be, went into the one structure connecting the dying field to everything else alive on that grid, the heat exchange loop. 11 kilometers of aging return line straight to Redgate, under the perimeter road, under Lowfield freight apron, under the flood channel, under the market terraces. The line did not fail everywhere. It failed where Del Arno's margin notes and a dog's nose had been saying it would fail, at the old joints, the weeps, the places where trace gas had been whispering up through soil and deck plate for a season at concentrations only one nose on the planet could read. At Lowfield, the buried main under the freight apron's eastern undercroft ruptured and took the apron deck with it, the same apron where, by the Combine's own generous scheduling, a chartered cargo hull stood loading, and where a deathworld-rated transport crate, inspected and signed and empty, was waiting on its flatbed for an 0800 departure that an examiner's two-line message had delayed into the only mercy of the morning. At the flood channel, the standpipes blew again, worse. Along the market terrace's lowest tier, the channel wall slumped into the service undercroft beneath the morning market, and the terraces, sail shades and stalls and beings of four species went down into the dust and steam after it. The colony sirens took 11 seconds to start. Reska counted every one of them, standing in the crossvein yard with the shockwave's dust still standing in the air above the north fence line, and then the counting part of her shut itself off, and the surgeon part took the rest of her to the hauler at a dead run. Tess Vane was already there. So was the dog, standing at the tailgate, on shift, harness taut, pointed at the rising smoke like a needle finally agreeing with its compass. So, 10 seconds later, was Examiner Hadley, who hauled herself into the truck bed with the field battery sample kit still in one hand, and Officer Cantrev Mull, who looked once at the transport order in his hand, folded it into his uniform pocket, and climbed up after her, and Imkit with the med kit, and Atra the night nurse with the second one. Lowfield, Mull said. The apron's gone. My wardens are at the terraces, Surgeon the Undercroft, the morning market. His plates were the color of ash. There were hundreds under those shades. Drive, said Reska. They hit Lowfield first, because the perimeter road went nowhere else, and because the apron, when they reached it, reached back. A warden flagging traffic at the freight gate, dust still rolling off the broken ground beyond, and somewhere inside it a sound that carried over the engine, metal on metal, rhythmic, deliberate, knocking. The eastern undercroft had folded like wet card. The charter hull itself stood untouched on its pad, comically whole, but the loading structures between it and the road were a stepped ruin of deck plate and conveyor frame, and the flatbed that had delivered a deathworld-rated transport crate to the Crossvein 9 days earlier sat at the edge of the break, with its cab, crushed flat under a fallen gantry and its cargo, the crate, the beautiful engineered nowhere, inspected and signed and waiting, folded into scrap an arm's breadth thick. Reska looked at it for exactly 1 second. Some documents the universe files on its own. The knocking was the charter's 2 crewmen. They had been walking the load path when the main went. The Undercroft had taken them down a level and sealed the stairhead behind them, and the void they were in was filling, from below, with the same invisible tide that was about to shut down every rescue on Mall. The warden at the gate had a sniffer, and the sniffer said the stairhead was death. And that was everything the warden knew. It took Juno 4 minutes to know more. She came off the tailgate already working, crossed the apron and survey lines, refused the stairhead with a planted broadside that the warden wrote down verbatim. The animal declined the route the way a door declines a key, and took them instead along the Undercroft seam to a conveyor chase no instrument had thought to ask about, where the air, her body said, still moved clean. The lifting took 10 minutes and 4 beings and 1 borrowed freight jack. The 2 crewmen came up the chase wide-eyed and shaking, and the older one looked from the dog to the crushed crate on the flatbed and back to the dog, doing arithmetic no one helped him with. That's her, he said. We came for her. That's the one we came for. That's the one, Tess said, paying the anchor line back into its coil, already moving for the hauler, because the smoke over the terraces was getting taller. Lucky for you, she doesn't read manifests. The market terraces, when they reached them, had stopped being a place and become a condition. The lowest tier was simply gone, folded down into the Undercroft along 60 meters of frontage, a stepped wound of slab deck, snapped shade rigging, crushed stalls, and dust that the morning sun turned into a slow golden fog. Steam stood up out of the flood channel in columns. The second tier hung over the break in cantilevered slabs that groaned when the wind leaned on them. And everywhere, in the fog, beings, the walking ones streaming up and out with the unhurried wrongness of the deeply shocked. The kneeling ones, calling down into gaps, and under it all, audible the moment the hauler's engine died, the buried ones, knocking. The colony's emergency services arrived in numbers and did what they had drilled for, and it was not nothing. Cordons, triage lanes, lifting teams on the accessible slabs. But Redgate's hazard crews had drilled for fires and pressure leaks, and what they faced was a collapsed, three-dimensional maze flooded with pockets of an odorless gas that their handheld sniffers sampled one arm's length at a time under slabs that shifted, in a fog that ate sightlines. Twice in the first half hour, a rescue team had to be rescued. Lifting crews following sound into a void that the gas had already claimed, going down mid-call like switched-off machines, dragged out by their anchor lines. The incident commander, a gray-plated Cusk fire captain with 4 decades of service, made the only sane call available to a being with her. Instruments. Pull back, vent what could be vented, wait for the mapping drones from the Enclave, 6 hours out. The beings in the ground did not have 6 hours. Everyone in the cordon knew it. The knocking told them. Reska was at the triage lanes with Imkit and Atra, up to her elbows in the morning's first harvest of the walking wounded, when the argument at the command post rose above the general roar, a young human voice and an old human voice, and an administrator's voice backing them both, and she looked up to see the fire captain staring down at 40 kilos of Earth Predator in a working harness, sitting at heel in the middle of an alien disaster, calm as deep water. Absolutely not, the captain said. Captain. Examiner Hadley's voice was the one she had used on the charter. I certify hazard detection animals for a living. Your sniffers sample a point. That animal samples the whole structure with every breath continuously while moving, and she has a trained alert for exactly the gas that has nearly killed 2 of your teams. There is 1 of her in 400 kilometers. It's a deathworld animal. I have 300 civilians in a cordon and a public that watched her pull 14 children off of steam. Great 3 weeks ago, Officer Kantrev Mol said. He had his slate out, his office's authority in front of him like a tool he was only now discovering the proper use of. Containment statute gives my office disposition over this animal's deployment in declared emergencies. I am the containment officer of record. I am deploying her. A beat then, with the first crack anyone had ever heard in the administrative flatness. Captain, I have read every complaint ever filed against this animal, and I have come to understand that they all describe the same event. Something is about to die, and she is the only one in the room who knows. We are all at this moment standing in that room. Let her work. The captain looked at the dog. The dog looked back, soft-eyed, unbothered, ears already swiveling across the rubble field in long, slow passes, reading the structure under everyone's feet. Then she looked at the dust-fogged ruin and at her own instruments and made the decision that put her in the Enclave's textbooks within the year. Conditions, she said. She works ahead of my teams, not instead of them. Her handler stays on the anchor line. And when this is over, somebody is going to teach my crews what her alerts mean. When this is over, Hadley said, I expect that to be a certification course. What followed went into the inquest record as 11 hours of continuous search and rescue operations, and into Redgate's memory as something there has never been an administrative word for. The dog worked the collapse the way she had worked her handler's survey grid, in lines and passes, tireless, exact. Tess ran the anchor line and the command set. Hadley ran liaison to the lifting teams, and the gas, the invisible tide that had shut down the whole rescue, became simply another fact in the field. Because the dog's body wrote it out for everyone to read. Where she walked freely, teams followed. Where she checked and detoured, the route died and a marker went down. Twice she planted herself broadside across an opening exactly as she had planted herself at Bay 9. No growl, no fuss, just a wall with fur, and both times the void behind her, sampled by pole-mounted sniffer, came back at concentrations the hazard chief read out loud and then read again, quieter, and where the buried were, she sat and gave the 3-in-1. The first find was a vendor pinned under her own stall frame, an arm's length below a slab no instrument would have looked twice at. The second was a void with 5 beings in it, including 2 of the porters who had been scalded at the culvert 3 weeks before, who could be heard, when the lifting crew opened a passage, explaining to their fellow casualties with the authority of veterans that this exact dog had done this exact thing for them already, and everyone could now relax. The 7th find, the records kept count, nobody in the fog did, was a Grolan calf alive, walked out on its own legs, an entry the inquest preserved because the dog had alerted on it with precisely the same gravity as on everyone else, and the lifting crew had dug for it just as hard, and something about that fact, witnesses agreed, recalibrated the day for every species present. The 13th find was Dorvek Heil. The feed contractor had been at the lowest tier that morning, arguing a delivery, and the Undercroft had taken him whole, dropped him, stall and cart and all, into a service gallery and folded the deck over the entrance. He had been knocking for 5 hours. The void was deep, gas flooded at its mouth, reachable only along a route the dog had to right one careful body length at a time, Tess paying out the anchor line behind her into a gap no adult of any local species could have entered. The body cams caught what the audio caught, the scrape and shift of a being hauling himself toward the light, and then the moment, preserved, replayed. Never not strange. When Dorvek Heil came up out of the dark with his hand wrapped in the chest strap of a deathworld predator's harness, hauled the last meter by 40 kilos of steady reverse traction, and sat in the rubble in the sunlight, alive, with his face pressed into the dusty fur of her shoulder, saying nothing whatsoever that the complaint form had a box for. He withdrew the complaint that night, in writing, from a hospital cot. The withdrawal form had a field for reason. He wrote, "I was wrong about what I was looking at," and underneath it, unprompted, a second line the clerks left in the file. "She remembered me, and came anyway." Reska saw almost none of it as it happened. Her own 11 hours were spent at the triage lanes in the cordon's lee, where the finds became patients and the patients became outcomes, and her provisional, career-limiting, exotic and unclassified credential turned out to mean the one surgeon on the planet who had spent a month learning that anatomy is a language with dialects. She clamped cusk bleeders and splendid moray wing struts and burr-holed a Vorn skull by field improvisation, and somewhere in the afternoon she realized that the lifting teams had started bringing her the impossible ones first. On the grounds, she heard a warden say it, plainly as settled fact, that the deathworld surgeon doesn't lose them. She lost 2 that day, of the 51 souls the collapse put through her hands. She kept the names of both in the back of her case file for the rest of her career, beside the count of the ones who walked out. The inquest fixed the final figures. 34 beings recovered alive from the collapse zone by canine-led search. Every single live recovery initiated by the dog's alert before instruments confirmed. 0 rescuer fatalities. 0 gas casualties among the teams after her deployment. And 1 finding written into the formal record over the fire captain's signature that the examiner read aloud at the certification course she did in fact establish. At hour 9, the animal refused a cleared route along the second tier despite direct handler encouragement, planting and holding against the line. The route was reflagged for survey. The cantilevered slab above it failed 11 minutes later. There were at that time 14 rescue personnel staged beyond it who had intended to use that route. The investigating board has been unable to construct any instrumental or procedural system that would have produced this refusal, and recommends, in place of further analysis, that the colony stop trying to explain the animal and start training to her. At hour 11, with the last knock answered and the fog burning off and the mapping drones from the enclave arriving overhead to confirm, in 6 hours of beautiful high-resolution detail, what a nose had already written in the dust, Juno walked the length of the triage lane, slowly now, finally tired, her paws wrapped where Imkit had taped them at hour 6, and found Tess Vane, and leaned against her knee and sat down and was, visibly, off shift. The cordon crowd had been watching her for 11 hours. Redgate had been arguing about her for a month. The argument was over. Nobody announced it. It was simply over, the way weather is over. A Murray mother near the cordon line lifted her smallest child onto her shoulders to see, and the child raised one membrane-bright arm and called out across the lane the only human word it knew for her, the word 14 schoolchildren. Had brought home 3 weeks ago, and every household in the lower terraces had learned since. And the word came back from the crowd in a swell of 200 voices in 4 species accents, ragged and absurd and unanimous, while the dog it was aimed at yawned hugely against her handler's leg and let the noise pass over her like "Son, Juno, Juno, Juno." Director Savin Roque did not attend the cordon. By the time the chant reached its 3rd iteration, the Combine's evening statement was already drafted, regrettable, unforeseeable, geological, and it was released at dusk, and it lived for exactly 14 hours, which was how long it took Magistrate Unwer to convene the evidentiary review she no longer saw any reason to schedule for the following month. Entered Del Arno's cash into the record over counsel's objection. Here Imkit walked the bench through 240 days of a dead man's mounting alarm. Here the Utilities Directorate confirmed that the cascade had propagated through precisely the joints his margins flagged. And here, from the Combine's own subpoenaed site logs, the 14-minute call summary with the response line preserved in administrative amber. Noted, survey to continue per schedule. The finding when it came was not dramatic. Findings never are. Reska had learned that much watching this colony work. Negligent disregard of contractor safety advisories. Operation suspended pending recertification of the entire lease. Referral of named officers for prosecution. A remediation bond that made the Combine's audit budget look like pocket gravel. And one line, small, near the end, that Tess Vane read out loud in the staff room with her hand resting on a sleeping dog's ribs. The contract surveyor's final advisory is entered into colonial best practice. The board notes for the record that Surveyor Arno's findings were correct in every particular and that the colony's failure to receive them was not his. "You hear that?" the girl said softly, not to the room. "You hear that, big girl?" He was right. Everybody knows he was right. The dog slept on. She had known it all along. Director Savin Roque's last appearance on Mall was at the prosecution referral hearing, and Reska attended it, not from appetite. She had discovered she had none for ruin, even deserved ruin, but because the magistrate's clerk had listed her as a witness to the intake of the animal, and the defense, in its final inventiveness, had decided the animal was its best remaining argument. Counsel's closing theory, polished and doomed, was that no operator could reasonably have foreseen what only a deathworld-evolved sensory apparatus had detected. That the colony was, in effect, retroactively holding the Combine to the standard of a dog. Magistrate Unwer let the sentence finish. Then she did the thing Redgate quoted for a generation. She had the clerk read back slowly the response line from the site log, noted, "Survey to continue per schedule," and asked counsel whether that had been addressed to the dog or to the man. "The colony does not hold your client to the standard of the animal," she said when no answer came. "The animal exceeds every standard this bench could lawfully impose. The colony holds your client to the standard of the surveyor it hired, who met it 14 minutes at a time until your client's schedule killed him. Referral stands." Roque left on the next outbound lift, ahead of his own subpoenaed officers, in the gray manner of beings whose risk ledgers have finally balanced. The freight crews at Lowfield, rebuilding their apron on the remediation bond his signature had funded, did not jeer as his shuttle lifted. Redgate had used up its appetite for noise on the 9th of Green Month, but the duty warden's log for that hour, and Reska checked, because by then she knew how this colony wrote its true history, in margins, in logs, in the boxes forms provided for other things, recorded the departure in a single entry that said everything the Terraces had decided about who, in the end, had been the wild variable in the risk ledger, and who had been the colony's surest instrument. Outbound shuttle, card and charter, departed 1411. No incident. The dog did not get up. The paperwork outlived the disaster, as paperwork does, and for 9 more days it remained technically true that there was a crate with Juno's name on it. The crate itself had been destroyed. The apron undercroft had taken the flatbed, the climate loop, and the charter's entire loading bay, an irony nobody at the Crossvane could be persuaded to stop mentioning, but the order it served was a statute, and statutes do not collapse with their infrastructure. Statute 11 still said what it had said for 40 years, an unclaimed Deathworld-class animal could not remain on Mall. So on the 9th day after the cascade, Tess Vane walked into the public office of the Redgate Office of Animal Standards on her rest day morning, in her cleanest work jacket with a dog at heel and a folder under her arm, and stood at the counter that no human had ever stood at for this purpose in the colony's history, and said the sentence she had practiced all night in the kennel wing, until Imkett begged her to sleep, "I'm here to make a claim." Officer Cantrev Mole came out of his back office to take it personally. He had, it became clear, been preparing for this transaction with the thoroughness of a being who had waited his whole administrative life for a form to finally do something he approved of. The claim file he had assembled ran 90 pages. Examiner Hadley's assessment, completed in the field. The formal battery had never been finished, the examiner had noted, because the candidate team was called away mid-test to conduct an 11-hour live deployment, which the examining authority has elected to score in its place, and which constitutes the highest-graded handler assessment this office has recorded, sat on top with the certification line filled in, handler of record, Vane T, successor to Arno D, transfer of working bond confirmed by direct observation. Beneath it, the Crossvine's letter of employment, hazard detection consultant, signed by the facility surgeon of record. Beneath that, the veterinary fitness certificate, signed by the same hand. And beneath that, in the place of the statute's checklist marked ownership status, where 40 years of intake clerks had typed unclaimed, Mole had already entered in the careful script of a being committing an act of administration he intended to defend to the death. Claimed, registered working partnership. Statute 11 not applicable. He stamped it while the whole front office watched, and the stamp came down like a gate closing, and then Officer Cantrev Mole, containment officer, 11 repatriations, career compliance man, leaned over his own counter and gravely offered his hand, palm up, to a Deathworld predator, who sniffed it once and then conversationally leaned her whole head into it, and the office clerks gave up all pretense of working. The transport order is voided, Mull said, to test but loudly enough for the room, rubbing one sable ear with a thoroughness that suggested research. The repatriation file is closed. For the record, Specialist Vane, your animal is now subject to the same registration renewals, working animal welfare inspections, and public conduct provisions as any licensed hazard auxiliary on Mull. He paused and added, deadpan administrative to the last. Her conduct record, I am required to inform you, currently contains 4 incident reports and 11 commendations. The ratio is the worst I have ever certified. The commendations usually come first. The license review came for Reska in the same week, as the Combine's council had designed it to, and it arrived into a changed world. The Veterinary Licensing Board convened at the Enclave by remote session to examine the provisional credential of Surgeon Reska Ven, specifically, the complaint that she had certified one animal simultaneously unfit to travel and fit for field rehabilitation, an inconsistency. The filing said, suggestive of advocacy rather than medicine. The board's senior assessor read the complaint into the record. Then she read the responses the file had accumulated since. From the incident commander of the Lowfield Cascade Fire Service, regarding 51 casualties treated at a field triage lane by the surgeon under review. From the Redgate Magistracy, noting that the surgeon's allegedly inconsistent medical hold had kept alive, on planet, the sole detection asset later credited with 34 live recoveries. From the Office of Animal Standards, in dry administrative prose that did not entirely conceal its author, observing that the surgeon's clinical record in deathworld class medicine now constituted the only such record in the sector, and recommending the board consider not whether to retain her credential but how to replicate it. And finally, from Surgeon Prime Othick of the Crossvein Veterinary Trauma Hall, Othick, who had said no at the intake desk, whose incident reports had fed the first month's machinery, and whose letter Reska had not been shown until the assessor read it aloud. I declined this case, Othick had written. I declined it on correct grounds, correctly weighed, in full compliance with every standard this board maintains, and had my judgment prevailed, 14 children would have died at a market crossing, and 34 beings would still be under the Lowfield terraces. The board should retain Surgeon Ven's credential. The board should then ask itself, as I have been asking myself nightly, what our standards are for, if compliance with all of them produces the wrong answer at the only moments that matter. I have no recommendation on that question. I have only the count. The provisional credential was converted to full with sector specialty, deathworld origin biota. The board further voted on the assessor's motion to commission a clinical reference from the case file of patient Juno, Redgate, the file half the veterinary services on 3 worlds would eventually request, and Reska went home from the remote session and sat for it while in the empty theater where it had all started, and then went down to the service yard where a girl was throwing a ball for a dog in the late gold light, as if the universe contained nothing else that needed doing, and discovered that her species could, after all, weep. It simply waited until the surgeon was off shift. The offers began arriving the following month because the galaxy reads inquest records the way scavengers read wind. A planetary defense consortium 2 systems over inquired about purchasing the animal outright, named a figure with enough zeros to retire the Crossvine's debt, and received from Officer Mull's office a 1-line reply that entered Redgate. Folklore. The asset you wish to purchase is not property. The partnership you wish to purchase is not for sale. The office you have contacted does not sell beings. Choose any one of these as your formal answer. A Xenofauna Institute requested tissue samples and was referred to the welfare provisions. 3 colonial administrations asked, more humbly, whether the detection and rescue methodology could be taught, and that letter Hadley answered herself, because the answer was the certification course, already running, with the Redgate Fire Service's first cohort drilling response patterns in the Crossvein yard every 5th day while a sable and tan instructor demonstrated the gas alert for biscuits. And one offer came on paper, by hand from the Human Enclave Survey Service, an apprenticeship, surveyor trainee, geological and atmospheric assessment, posted to Redgate, assigned to the colony's newly commissioned hazard survey contract. The contract magistrate's remediation order had created, the one that would spend the next decade walking every kilometer of Mull's tired old infrastructure, instruments and a nose. They had attached Del Arno's service record to the offer, with a flag on his final evaluation, where some Enclave supervisor had written, 8 months before anyone on Mull knew her name, Arno's Enclave liaison work commendable. Note, the kennel assistant at the Crossvein facility, T-Vane, demonstrates exceptional aptitude with working stock. Recommend recruitment if a vacancy arises. He recommended me, Tess said. She had read the flag 11 times, and her voice still did the complicated thing. Before any of it, he never said, He used to let me run her through wind checks at the market, and he never once said. She put the paper down with both hands very carefully, the way you put down something that has decided your life. A vacancy arose, she said, half to herself, half to the dog lying across her boots, and signed. There was one more incident, and Reska always included it when she told the story properly, because it was the one that proved the colony had actually learned something, which is rarer than heroism. It happened in the cold season, 4 months after the cascade on an ordinary fifth day. The remediation crews had been re-sleeving the heat exchange return line section by section, working in from the field and the segment under the Crossvein's own district. Old line, patch line, low priority, scheduled for the following month, chose a quiet gray morning to start whispering. No instrument heard it. The district sensors, brand new, post-inquest, sampled their points and found their points acceptable. Juno, asleep in the kennel wing doorway through the third hour of Tess's shift, woke up, crossed the yard, and sat down at the north fence facing out, and gave the gas alert. Once. What happened next took 4 minutes, and Reska timed it from her office window with a pride she never managed to make. Sound clinical. Tess called it in on the hazard channel using the protocol Hadley's course had drilled. The duty officer, fire service, first cohort, certificate on her wall, did not ask whether a dog could know such a thing. She asked for the bearing. The district isolation valves were closed within the half hour. The line crew, retasked, found the failing weld by mid-afternoon. 11 days ahead of the leak, the modeling said, would have put a street's worth of beings in beds or worse. The incident report ran 1 page. Under initiating detection, the duty officer had typed without comment in the place where instrument designations went. K9 Juno, Cert Had 01. No crowds, no chanting, a line item. The dog was back asleep in the doorway before the valves were closed. That's the victory, Hadley said, when the report crossed her desk. Anyone can be a miracle once. The job was always to become boring. The remediation crews reached Bore 4 in the first thaw month, and the colony discovered that it had been waiting for that without knowing it. The gallery could not be reopened. The survey said so, and on Mall now when a survey said so, machines stopped, so the work was a ceiling. The throat of the bore shored, capped, and faced with dressed stone, and the apron where a man had spent his last morning grated clean and planted, on the magistrate's order, with the gray-green hardy scrub that was the only thing on Mall that flowered. The enclave asked for a memorial. The colonial administration, to everyone's surprise, asked to share it. So on a bright, cold fifth-day morning, perhaps 400 beings made the trip up the perimeter road, surveyors and fire crews and feed contractors, an examining authority who claimed to be present strictly in an assessment capacity, and stood in the front row, 14 Mireille schoolchildren with their 2 adults, a containment officer in dress plates, a surgeon prime who came unannounced and stood at the back, and a young woman in a surveyor trainee's field jacket with a dog at her left knee, and watched the enclave's flag and the colony's flag go up the same mast above a plate of dressed stone. The plate did not say very much, because the labor office's forms had never had a field for what it needed to say, and in the end they had given the words to the person who had known him at the markets and let her fight the character limit. It read, Del Arno, surveyor. He listened to the ground and told the truth and put what he loved behind him. The ground remembers. So do we. The Arno Gallery. There were speeches, brief ones, and Reska retained almost nothing of them because she spent the ceremony doing what she had spent a year learning to do, which was watching the dog. Juno had come up the road on shift, working head level. Tess had decided, and Hadley had endorsed it, that the harness was kinder than the alternative. The ground held nothing for her now but old echoes, and the harness gave her something to do with them. She held her downstay through the flags and the speeches with her ears at half-mast, reading the crowd, reading the wind off the bore field. Reading? Reska's heat pits confirmed what everyone suspected. The exact patch of graded, planted ground where the spoil berm had been, the place her own paws had moved a mountain 1 egg-soft mouthful at a time. When it ended, the crowd did not quite disperse. It lingered, the way crowds do when they feel a thing is unfinished and cannot name the missing piece. And Tess Vane walked the dog forward to the foot of the stone and unclipped the lead and took off her glove, her own, the right-hand field issue, 4 months of a new trade worn into the palm of it, and held it down where a sable head could read it. Juno, she said clearly in the wind, in front of 400 witnesses and 2 flags. Mark, it was not a trained exercise. It was not in Dell's manual or Hadley's battery. The examining authority in her assessment capacity would have been obliged to score it improvisation handler. The dog took the glove from the girl's hand, egg-soft, unhurried, and carried it to the stone and laid it down at the base on the new gravel with the deliberation of a being completing a delivery she had signed for long ago. Then she stepped back and sat and looked up at the plate's incomprehensible human letters with her ears forward, as though the ground might say something back through them. It didn't, of course. The wind moved the scrub. 11 kilometers south-southeast, faint as a pulse, the colony went about its morning. The dog read it all once, filed it, and turned around and came back to her handler's knee and leaned. Dell's glove, the scent article, the relic, was not at the stone and never had been. That had been settled weeks before. At the kennel wing workbench, on a quiet evening Reska had been invited to in the manner of a family rite. Imkit holding the light, Atra threading needles she insisted no one else's hands were steady enough for, and Tess unpicking the worn leather palm of a dead man's work glove and stitching it, panel by careful panel, into the lining of a working harness's chest pad, inside, where the buckle pressure rode, where a dog's own heartbeat would keep it warm. Not a shrine. Equipment. He went on shift with her now, every shift. Where he had always been, the harness clocked them both on together. He'd laugh at us, Tess had said around the pins in her teeth that evening. Sentimental civilians. Then he'd check the stitching. She had tied off the last seam and turned the pad over and pressed it flat with both hands once, like a verdict. Double locked. Check it yourself. Arno. Spring opened the survey season, and the colony got used to a site that would have emptied a street the year before. A surveyor trainee and a sector-certified hazard auxiliary walking the infrastructure lines out from Redgate every working morning, instruments on the girl's back, the planet's whole slow conversation coming in through the dog's feet and nose, the two of them threading the pipe galleries and the flood channel and the district mains and survey lines as exact as anything her first handler ever staked. The contracts for season report, filed under Vane T. Trainee with the examiner co-signing, identified 19 degraded segments for the remediation schedule. 4 of them flagged priority by Canine Alert before instrumental confirmation, all 4 confirmed. The Utilities Directorate, which had once referred a dead man's data sideways into oblivion, now had a standing morning practice the crews called, without irony, asking the dog. At the Crossvein, the change came in smaller denominations. The board approved the sector's first Deathworld biota ward that summer, 2 bays. A consulting office, a brass plate Reska considered grandiose and Imkit polished weekly, and the patients came. A freighter family's elderly house cat needing a growth removed, escorted up the corridor past a waiting room that watched it the way commuters watch. A passing tiger with respect and no movement whatsoever. A working falcon off a grain hauler with a wing strut sprain. An enclave child's rabbit, whose intake form, under temperament, Imkit, senior resident now, and the ward's second-best needle, gravely entered as Deathworld class. Docile, which was, Reska had to concede technically accurate on both counts. And on a bright market 5th day at summer's height, a small alien drama played out in the Crossvine's public waiting room that Reska watched from the intake desk and recorded that evening in her private log as the true close of the case, whatever the file said. A human dockhand came in carrying an earth pup, a fat, sleepy, 8-week-old scrap of shepherd stock off the season's family transport, in for its settlement vaccinations, and the waiting room, the same room that had emptied itself in 11 seconds a year before, did not empty. It rearranged. The Velhound on the floor, the same Velhound. Maul was a small place, lifted its head, took the pup's measure, and shifted 6 centimeters to the left, conceding the warm patch of sun by the window. Its owner moved her feet. A Mire father lifted his smallest child to see, and the child, market-raised, market-schooled, looked at the pup with the unimpressed expertise of the young and rendered the room's verdict in trade pidgin. Little Juno. The pup, who was nobody, who would grow up to guard a dock office and chase drone shadows and never once in a long, happy life do anything that made an inquest, fell asleep in the dockhand's arms in the sun, in a room full of beings who had learned the difference between fearing a thing and respecting it. Reska wrote it down because no one else would think it worth writing, and she had become, by then, the keeper of this particular truth, that the great victories announced themselves in stadiums and the real ones in waiting rooms, 6 centimeters at a time. Othic found her at the intake desk that same week, with a slate and a request the old surgeon prime had plainly rehearsed. The board wanted a successor track planned. Othic's plates were graying at the rims. The Crossfiend would want, in time, a surgeon prime who had operated on everything the freight manifests could deliver. "I have submitted one name," Othic said, stiffly, formally, and then with the first fully unguarded expression Reska had ever seen on that armored face. "I am told the candidate once accepted a case at this desk against my direct advice. The board considers this the strongest item in her file. So, for the record, does the surgeon prime." He left before she could answer, which she understood between professionals to be the point. The anniversary of the cascade fell on a 5th day, and Redgate marked it the way the inquest had recommended, and nobody had quite believed a colony would actually do, not with speeches but with a drill. Sirens at 0851. The market terraces cleared to the assembly points. The fire service ran the gas response pattern. The schools walked their classes up the high road in 14 minutes flat. At the Crossven, the Kennel Wing's whole population was moved to the yard on the new evacuation protocol, a procedure complicated by the protocol's senior instructor electing to supervise from the middle of the route, lying down, while 2 seasons of fire service trainees stepped around her with the reverence of cadets stepping around a monument. Hadley, visiting for the recertifications, watched the whole exercise with her arms folded and pronounced it, in her capacity as the sector's foremost authority, adequate, which those who knew her understood to be a weeping tribute. That evening, when the drill was scored and the yard was empty and the long gold light was doing what it did, Reska finally performed the small administrative act she had been saving for a year the way other beings save a bottle. She opened the case file of patient Juno, Redgate, intake number 1107K, deathworld origin canid, female. 200 pages now, annexed, cross-referenced, requested by 3 worlds. The fractures, the burns, the grief charted like weather. Problem 5, and she scrolled to the end, to the discharge summary that had stood incomplete for 4 seasons because its final field had no honest answer until now. The form offered her the standard dispositions: repatriated, transferred, retained under statute, deceased, released to owner. She struck them all. And in the override field that existed for cases the forms had never imagined, she wrote the discharge in her own hand, the way the whole case had been conducted, and signed it and closed the file. Disposition, home. The patient selected it herself. Treatment consisted of not standing in her way. Below the office window in the last of the light, the colony's first human surveyor walked in through the yard gate with the day's instruments on, her back footsore, dusty, 24 years old, the registered partner of the most decorated animal in the sector's history, and the dog at her knee, off shift the moment the gate latched, harness already half shrugged, a dead man's glove riding warm over her heartbeat, and a living girl's hand riding warm between her ears, broke heel without permission, for nothing, for joy, and bounced once like a pup at the smell of dinner. Somewhere north-northwest, the planet murmured along its mended lines and said nothing worth reporting. The dog checked it anyway, one ear, old habit. Then she followed her person in, through the doors of the building that had once emptied at the sight of her, past the night nurse who saved her biscuits and the resident who owed her a life, and the wall where her photograph hung between 2 flags, and lay, down in the kennel wing doorway, in the warm spot where she could see every exit and the girl at the same time, and let out the long breath that went all the way down to the floor. The Crossveen logged it, because the Crossveen had learned to log what mattered. Night shift, all wards, quiet, the newest line of an old running joke, the truest sentence in the colony's records, written fresh at the bottom of every morning report since the cold season, was entered once more by whichever clerk had the duty and the privilege. All quiet, the dog is sleeping in the doorway, and 11 kilometers away, under a stone plate at the foot of a sealed gallery, a worn right-hand glove lay where it had been delivered, through dark and collapse and grief, and a year of stubborn, gentle refusal, by the only courier in the galaxy who had never once failed to find her man. Signed for, the ground might have said, if the ground said anything. Received.